Boom.
Yes.
Let's cross fingers that the flight. Oh, now I
Yeah.
can see you. Now I can see you.
Yeah.
Let's hope I can
So
cross border, find the hotel, then find the school, and manage
right.
to get there. Okay, where are my
So
notes?
do you make decision the final flight? So we'll organize how to pick you up in May. Yeah.
Um, you received my message. I'm arriving on Friday
On
morning. Is
Friday.
this what you're
Okay.
asking? Yes,
Yes. Yes.
on
I
Friday.
got it.
But as I mentioned, the hotel where I'm staying, they are sending a car.
Yeah. Okay.
So there
Okay.
is no need for you to come to the airport at 9 in the morning.
Yeah. Maybe I will wait you in the hotel. Let's meet there. Yes.
Yes, or perhaps in the afternoon, I can come to after I take a shower, etc. I can come to school
Sure.
and, well,
Welcome.
yeah. But that will be on Friday at some point. Good,
Okay.
good. And
Good.
are you in the classroom or are
I'm
you?
not in the classroom because
Ah,
this is the final day before the labor holiday. So,
oh,
but
that's right.
the
Tomorrow is the
students
first
are
of
in
May.
classroom. Yeah, yeah, yes. From May the 1st to May the 5th, we have a 5 days holiday. So, but
Well,
our students is all in the classroom. So we have a lot students actually they participate, welcome them participate the Zoom, and also we have uh, 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 we have two other platform actually there give us a simultaneous transportation there. Okay, so let's welcome because last time I actually the first half of the lecture I mean in the lecture room, but the second half I go to participate a casual event. So
yes,
I
because you were at
actually
a conference, I remember.
yes. But I think it's quite interesting talking about the tools between the relationship between the architects and actually the tools, and that's a very fundamental beginning about the different revolution about the toolbox to the
Yeah,
future.
yeah.
So looking
This
forward
is
to
the
hear.
way I always start every
uh,
class I teach, as I said, even if it is for undergraduate, master, doctoral, I always start with a general introduction, call it ways of making, which
yeah,
of course can be a very brief introduction or a more detailed introduction according to the kind of students you're meeting. But it is the fundamental difference between what is specific to hand making, craft, what is specific to mechanical machine making, industrial, and what is specific to the digital, which is what we are interested in. But we want to know to what extent the digital is similar to the technologies that existed before us, and to what extent it is different. And this is, I
yeah.
mean, you don't understand what the spirit of the technical logic of the digital, we
Mhm.
cannot use it. Meaning we can use it, but we are bound to make mistakes because we do not interpret the spirit of the technology. But that's the spirit of the game. So
Good.
today, my
Okay.
plan is to continue exactly from where I stopped last week. So I recap, and
Mm.
are the students already, is already everyone online?
Yeah,
We can start?
classroom is no, the classroom is full of the PhD students. So there, Yan Chao, Yan Chao is staying with the students in the classroom. So at your face is in the
He's on
on
the screen.
on the screen. Yes, yeah. So so the screen is yours, actually, Mario. So
Yeah, I must share the
looking forward
screen.
for the second
Hold
lecture.
on. Share, share, share. And then I have to close this one. And where are my slides? Hold on. Slides are here. And I enlarge. Can you see my first slide?
Yes.
Good, because that's where I started last week.
Last time.
So,
Yes.
all right. Good to see you all again, even if I do not see you, but I understand you see me. That's an important thing. And let me restart from where I stopped last week. I just recap. Oh, hold on, I have to reposition this thing. Where does it go? here and here. Why is it horizontal? I want it. All right, I'm all set. So last week, when we met on this very same screen, I introduced in very general terms the spirit, the technical logic of the three ways of making: handmaking, mechanical machine making, digital making. Handmaking means craft, what we did when machines did not exist, when there was no machine and everything had to be done by hand, occasionally using some manual tools. Mechanical machine making comes with the Industrial Revolution, but of course, historians disagree on when the Industrial Revolution started. Most historians of economics make the Industrial Revolution start with the building of the first factories, with the coal and steam, and in England in the late 18th century. But for the story I'm telling you, in fact, the first technology which really introduced mass production and standardization was the printing press. The technical logic of making a mechanical matrix, a cast, a stamp, a die, a mold, and then using it many times. And so the more copies you make, the cheaper each copy will be, because you amortize the cost of the mechanical matrix you have to make at the very beginning. And then digital making, which is different from both craft and mechanical making, because there are no mechanical matrices. There are no cast, no stamp, no dies, no mold. Think of laser printing, think of 3D printing. There is no cast, there is no mold. And so there is no need to make more copies of the same model, because there is no model. Every copy can be different at the same unit cost. So the technical logic of the industrial age is mass production, economies of scale, standardization. We achieve economies of scale by mass producing standardized items. Whereas in the digital domain, if we use digital tools, the logic, we call it digital mass customization. And I explained to you that mass customization is in many ways an oxymoron, is a contradiction in terms, because mass comes from mass production. That's what factories do. And customization is what an artisan does. Now, the digital can mass produce as if it were a factory, because it uses machine, but it mass produce copies that can all be different at the same unit cost, just like an artisan would have made. So mass customization, the mass production of designed variations at no extra cost. So craft means variations. Mechanical machine making means exact replication of standardized identical copies in the pursuit of economies of scale, the factory, the industrial logic. The digital means mass customization, the mass production of items which may be all identical or all different at the same unit cost. That's the big difference in the spirit of these three different technologies. And this is where I stopped last week, and that was my last slide. And then I said, well, how does this apply to the history of architecture? And when I shift to the history of building and of architecture, I must produce some example of architecture, what it looked like when it was all made by hand, before the industrial age and before modernity, etc., etc. And so I generally take examples from the European Middle Age. This is a Gothic church, one of the most famous Gothic churches in France. According to some historians, this is where the Gothic was invented. It's the Cathedral of Chartres, spelling C-H-A-R-T-E-R-S, Chartres, which is not far from Paris. And it is all the history books, because it is best example of French Gothic. Started to build around 1140, that's the 12th century. Most of the facade that you see was built, and the nave was built in the 13th century, so starting 1225 to the end of the 13th century. But the tower on the left, which you see is different from the tower on the right, is very late. It was built in the 16th century, which is when the Gothic was basically over, and in Italy, the Renaissance had already started. So here a footnote is necessary, because when I tell the story in Europe or even in America, particularly if I tell the story in France, everyone knows this building because it is in all the history books. Whereas you, or many of you, may not be as familiar with this history because that's the history of Europe. But I have to tell you, the three partitions, hand making, mechanical machine making, digital making, the three technical logics are unrelated to any specific place. This separation of technologies is so general that it applies to every country, every region, every culture, every tradition, and even every social system around the world, across time and space. The only thing which is different is the timeline, because the industrial age came to different countries at different times. But when it came, the spirit, the technical logic of the machinery was still basically the same. So, for example, think of a moving assembly line, which I described briefly last week. In the history books, you will find that the moving assembly line was invented by Henry Ford in America when he started to mass produce the first standardized car, the Model T Ford. Starts in 1909, produced in 1927 or something. And the idea of the moving assembly line, where the worker doesn't move and repeats the same motion, the same gestures, many times in a sequence. This idea is the consequence of studies, which were mostly American studies at the time. Frederick Taylor, the Principle of Scientific Management, a book he published in 1911, and another person we shall mention, Frank Gilbreth, who a few years earlier had invented time and motion studies. So the idea of how we can rationalize or streamline, if you like, the motions, the gestures of a body of an artisan to make his movement more efficient and safer, hence more profitable. The rule is, instead of making many motions, make fewer, faster motions. To put all this together, it converges into Henry Ford's idea of a moving assembly line, which was described by the slogan which Henry Ford invented around 1909. Instead of bringing the worker to the work, I bring work to the worker. The worker doesn't move. All the work he has to do is conveyed to him by moving assembly lines. So the worker, the motion of the workers is reduced to the minimum, repeats the same motion many times over, so it's faster and more profitable and cheaper, etc., etc. Now, this idea mostly derived from American studies of the time, and the first moving assembly line was introduced in Detroit in the factory that Henry Ford built around 1909. So we know where it started, but as soon as industrialists around the world could see how it worked and how effective it was, the moving assembly line was adopted by almost every country around the world very soon. So there was the war, of course, World War I, which slowed down the diffusion of technology. But after World War I, after 1918, many European industries adopted the Fordist model because it was effective, because that was the best way of using the technology. It saved time, it saved money. So in Europe, starting from the early 20s, many industrialists in every country, basically, in liberal countries like the United Kingdom was, France in the 30s would be a socialist country, they still adopted it. Italy was already a fascist country because Mussolini took power in 1922, but still fascist Italy adopted the moving assembly line, the American moving assembly line, just like a few years later, Nazi Germany did. When the Volkswagen was built in Germany, they adopted Ford idea of a moving assembly line. In the north of Europe, socialist country or social democratic country like Sweden adopted the moving assembly line. And importantly, as of the late 30s, and then even more in the 50s, communist, Stalinist Russia adopted the moving assembly line. So the same technology, which was making automobiles in Detroit for the capitalist American economy, was making automobiles in Tolyattigrad for the communist Soviet economy. Now, the social system was different. The, how do we call it? The ownership of the tool of production was different. Who owned the factory was different. Okay, but inside the factory, the spirit of the technology was the same. Every country, every social system adopted it because that was the best way to exploit that technology. And if this describes the adoption, the global adoption of mechanical technologies in the 20th century, this describes even better the global adoption of digital technologies now. Think of a robotic arm or a 3D printer. It would work exactly the same way if you put it in the center of Zurich, or in the center of Los Angeles, or if you put it in Hanoi, or meaning in Vietnam or in India. The technology is still the same, and it works in the same way. The spirit, the technical logic of the machine is the same, no matter where you put it. So basically, the same machine does the same things, technically speaking, evidently, globally. It's the same. So even if the examples I'm going to show to you are mostly examples drawn from the history of European architecture, because that's the history I know, and I cannot tell you another story. If I knew the history of Chinese architecture, I'm certain I could find equally good examples of the artisanal way of making as I could find in medieval Europe, because artisans are artisans. And medieval artisans in France probably worked in very similar ways to how pre-industrial artisans worked in China or in Japan or wherever. So look at this church and you will realize that it, what I mentioned, the spirit of artisan making is variations. Everything made by an artisan is always different because that's the way human bodies move. We cannot repeat the same gestures twice. So you will notice that in this building, nothing is identical. Every part is different. Even monumentally, you look at the facade, there are two towers. You would expect it to be symmetrical. The tower on the right, identical to the tower on the left. It isn't. It is true that the second tower was built 3 centuries after the first tower was built. But that doesn't matter, because if we adopted today's mentality, even if we build many years later, we would think that the second tower should be identical to the tower already built, because we think it should look that way, left and right, symmetry, etc., etc. They didn't see it that way. If you go in, and I don't have the pictures, but there is no need to see the pictures, you will understand what I'm talking about. If you go in, you will never find 2 identical pieces anywhere. There are columns, every column is slightly different. They're all similar, but they're never identical. Capitals at the top, where the columns becomes the ribs of the vault. All the capitals are similar, more or less similar, but they are never identical. You will not find 2 identical capitals anywhere. Every part is to some extent coordinated because it has to keep together. All the parts, all the components are similar, but they are never identical. Well, you know why? It is because this building was not built by architects nor by workers. It was built by artisans. It is strange for us to conceptualize it or even to admit it, but when this building was built, there was no design because there were no designers. The profession of a designer did not exist in the Middle Ages. There was no blueprint when this building was started, not because they couldn't bring the blueprint, there were no drawings, there was nothing. When they started to build, they had an idea of what they wanted to build. And the builders were teams of artisans organized in guilds or corporations according to their specialty. So there was a team of bricklayers, and were the bricklayers. There was a team of stone cutters. They were the stone cutters. There was a team of wood carvers. Each one of these teams was organized as a small cooperative, a society with different level of expertise. There were the apprentices, the journeymen, and the masters, the bosses of each guild or corporation. Each one of these team of builders received Mindways. They didn't receive a drawing. They didn't receive a model. They didn't receive a blueprint. They received a task, a description of what they had to do and how much they would be paid. And so the task of one team here was probably to, when they started to build the second tower, starting from, up there, because the foundation was already built, was build another tower. And they probably asked, yes, how tall should it be? And they probably said, well, as tall as you can make it. Do it at best. It's, every team did it in a different way. And here it is evident that the team who built the tower on the right was different from the team who built the tower on the left. The technology had improved. It was 2 centuries later. They could build it taller. They didn't feel obliged to build a copy or a replica of the tower already standing. You know why? Because they thought that at some point, the tower on the right would be rebuilt by another team. And when another team comes in to build or rebuild the tower on the right, they would make it even taller. Because that's the thing, there was no design, there was no designer. The building site was supposed to be open-ended. The idea was that the cathedral was a permanent building site, and people would keep building so long as they had money and the will to build. It was like a tree, like an organism. It was alive. It was the collective creation of a whole community. And mind you, evidence of what I'm telling you, there is no name associated to this building. There is the name of a bishop, since it was a church who started it, meaning the people who found the money and had the idea to build. But the builders were anonymous because they were just artisans. Who built the Cathedral of Chartres? This one. Nobody. We don't have a name. Many people working together. Many people without a name. Many nameless, anonymous artisans kept building for centuries. That is the way these buildings were built, the artisanal way. Each team built in their own way. No design, no designer. The building was an open-ended endeavor, the collective creation of an entire community, working together, many people, a group, a team, a cooperative, we would say today. There was no name, just a team, teamwork. And it was not a team of designers because each leader of each guild, being an artisan, he was a thinker and a maker at the same time. There was no plan. There was just a task, a problem to solve. Say, build that tower. And they would build it, and at some point it would be finished, and we start another one. But there was not a drawing at the start, and there was not a drawing at the end, where perhaps after it was built, drawing was made. But that's the way artisans work. Problem solving. You're given a task, you have to solve it at best. And not surprisingly, all these buildings are made of parts of which each one looks different. Why? Because each part was built by a different team, each one working in their own way. Now, this changes a few years later when the Renaissance comes. The Alberti, Michelangelo, Raphael, Palladio. This is Palladio as it happens. This is when things change drastically because, as you notice, and this is Palladio, at this point, a new profession was invented, which in the Middle Ages did not exist. Our profession, the profession of the designer, the profession of the architect. What you see here is a very modern design. I don't mean the forms, I mean the way the building was conceived. Plan, elevation, and section. We would call it a blueprint. You can see there is a plan drawn to scale, an elevation, part of elevation is a section, drawn to the same scale by the architect himself. That was Palladio, and the date is 1570. And at this point, there is design because a new profession has been invented. I hope perhaps we can get back to this point because it's quite important. It's the invention of our profession. It's the idea of Alberti and Raphael and Palladio in this instance. What the designer does is a drawing. Think of the difference. In the medieval site, every artisan is thinking and making at the same time. They receive a task and they solve it by putting things together. Here, the two jobs, the two tasks are separated. The designer makes a drawing, but he does not make the building. When the drawing is made, the designer calls the builders, gives the drawing, plans, elevation, and section, proportionally drawn to scale. Say, this is my idea. This is my drawing. Now you build it, and you don't change it. Or else, because that's my idea, that's my building. Separation of thinking and making, that's the foundation of modernity, for better or worse. The thinker doesn't make, the maker doesn't think. The architect, the designer, we think, what does the designer do? Buildings. Well, not exactly, because if you think of it, working this way, we do not make buildings. We make drawings of buildings. We do not lay bricks. We do not cut stones. We do not carve woods. The tool of our trade is pencil and paper, or it was. Now it's the computer. But the designer makes a drawing, doesn't make the building. The builders make the building, but they cannot change the drawing. The thinker doesn't make, the maker doesn't think. This is the invention of the modern liberal profession. The architect, the designer, is no longer an artisan, becomes an artist. See, the words are similar, but what we do is different. The artisan is the guy who's working on site, is laying bricks, cutting stones, carving woods in dirt and in trains. When it snows, it actually makes stuff. That's the artisan. The artist, this is Palladio, he doesn't go to, the building site. He works in an office, is elegant, presumably makes a lot of money, and he doesn't do the dirty job, just clean drawings. Makes the drawings, puts a name, a date, stamp, a signature on it, and then the builders, the contractors, will make the building, and we expect that the building will be identical copy of the drawings we made. In the case of Palladio, this is the very famous building, which is the materialization of his design. And as you may notice, not everything went to plan, because this one was supposed to have a dome. The dome was never built, because when they got there, they ran out of money, etc. But in principle, that's the idea. The building is the identical copy of the drawing which the designer made, which is a materialization of his idea. That was Alberti's, Leon Battista Alberti definition. The building is not an object. The building is an idea, conceived in the mind, expressed from drawings and models, and then executed without any change, but executed by someone else. The designer doesn't build, and the builder does not design. That's the invention of our profession. Separation of thinking and making, separation of design and building, separation of notations and realization or construction or materialization or, the building side. The design is on one side, the building side is something else. That's the separation, which is the foundation of our profession. But think of it, what happens in this case, if I can zoom up, look at the capitals, they are all identical. They are all the same. They didn't have any machines to print them or to reproduce them. Can I enlarge? Yeah. They just had drawings. These are artisans, the workers on site. They are obliged to make identical copies. And it is difficult to oblige an artisan to make 25 identical capitals because artisans normally do not work that way. If you ask an artisan to make 20 capitals, it will make 20 different capitals. You really have to insist and to coerce the artisan so that using the same template and the same pattern, he may more or less make identical copies. But this is an artisan who is already obliged to work as if he were a machine, because machines make identical copies. Humans generally don't, or they can, but at the cost of a huge personal effort. It's complicated for us humans to make identical copies of everything. So if you want to achieve that result, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, costs a lot of money. Then the Industrial Revolution came. Shift forward 200, 300 years. Here we are in Paris, mid-19th century, and metal has already arrived. This is cast iron. This is the inside, the interior of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, the Sainte-Geneviève Library, which is on the side of the Pantheon in Paris. It is still a university library. If you are a student at the University of Paris, you have a table in this library, built 1851 by Labrouste. As you noticed, these parts are now made in metal. They are made in cast iron, which is called cast iron because it is iron, but it is printed in casts, molds, or die. These capitals, or even these arches, well, I have only one in the picture, but if I had more, think of this capital, this one, a Corinthian capital. I don't know how many there are inside the building, but you can be certain that in this instance, they are really all the same. And you know why? Because they were all made in the same cast or mold or stamp or die, because this is cast iron. So to print these capitals, first you make a mold, probably in clay or something, and then you fill it, and then you separate the parts, and then with the same mold, you make another and another. These are printed capitals, 3D printed in a sense, but they are all the same. So in this case, using machines, using casts, stamps, or molds, or dies, you make identical copies of whatever you reproduce. All the columns are the same because they're made in the same way. All the arches are the same. Cast iron, it's iron which is made, printed in a cast. Form work. There is a cast, and then you print out, and all the replicas are the same. This is the logic of mass production. This is what factories do. If you make things that way with metal, using the same cast or mold many times makes sense. So the result is you standardize. These are standardized capital. They all look the same, and the more you make, the cheaper each one will be. As you may notice, the technology is new, but the architectural style is old. This is still good old Greek, Roman, European classicism. This is a composite capital. This is a Corinthian column, and the arches. So all the language of ornament is still purely classical, but the technology is new. So this is the paradox in the 19th century. A new revolutionary technology, cast iron, used to reproduce parts which used to be made in clay or in brick or in stone or in plaster. Technology is new, but it imitates older forms. The style is carried over, even if it is reproduced using a revolutionary new technology. And this went on for a while until he came. You know this guy, right? This is when he was old and famous, with his famous glasses, but now many architects still try to imitate. I don't know when this picture was taken, probably in the late 50s or early 60s. Le Corbusier was born in 1887 and he died in 1965. As you probably know, he died unexpectedly and tragically, was drowned at sea where he was swimming in the Mediterranean, taking a bath, and heart attack, and he died. This is when he was, old and famous, and this is when he was young and not famous at all. It's the same person, Le Corbusier, when he was successful, probably the most famous architect in the world at the time, and this is when he was just a young guy in his native Swiss village. His name was not even Le Corbusier at the time, because Le Corbusier was a fake name. He made it up. He was born with a different name. When this picture was taken, Le Corbusier was not called Le Corbusier. He was called Charles-Édouard Jeanneret. That was his family name. And he was not yet an architect. He was trained, think of that, he was trained as a watchmaker. He never studied architecture. Le Corbusier, well, he was born in a small village at the border between Switzerland and France, in a mountain chain called the Jura, which in the village where he was born, La Chaux-de-Fonds, still exists. At the time, everyone made watches, Swiss watches, still famous. Where do they make it? Well, that's where they make it, in the place where Le Corbusier was born. And by the way, La Chaux-de-Fonds, they still make watches today, very expensive watches. So in the place where he was born, everyone was a watchmaker. So there was no way to study anything else. So he became a watchmaker himself, because that's what his family had decided. He didn't go into the technology of watchmaking. The branch of watchmaking which he chose was a more artistic, so to speak. He specialized as a dial engraver. So there is a watch, well, not this watch, evidently, but a mechanical watch. It has a dial. Someone has to design those dials. That's his training. That's what Le Corbusier studied at school. Became the most famous architect in the world, but the only thing he studied at school was watchmaking or dial engraving. And by the way, when this picture was taken, he was evidently not yet an architect, he was a watchmaker. His name was not Le Corbusier, it was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret. He was not even French, because he was Swiss. So then, after World War I, he had, other ideas. He wanted to become an architect. Well, he started before World War I, of course. He went to Paris to practice under Perret. He went to Germany to practice under Behrens. So he was an apprentice in, choose the most famous practicing offices of the time. But he became famous after the war, when he had, we are here in 1921, the idea which changed his life, so to speak, and changed architecture since. That was the invention of Le Corbusier's invention of modernism, from his book Vers une architecture, or Towards a New Architecture. But it was first published in the journal he had founded, L'Esprit Nouveau, the New Spirit. His idea was the following. He was keenly observing the technology of the moving assembly line in America. Fordism, Taylorism, all the story I told you. The story I told you is important for architecture because Le Corbusier studied it. And he came to this conclusion, which made perfect sense. He said, automobiles used to be expensive because they were custom made by hand, by artisan, on specs. Every car is different. You make cars that way, every car is custom made, cars are a luxury item, they cost a lot. Then Henry Ford changed the way of making them. Mass production of standardized cars, economies of scale, car become cheaper and more affordable. And Le Corbusier's idea was, why should we not do the same with architecture? Why shouldn't we do to architecture what Henry Ford did to the automobile? Think of it, architecture is expensive. Why? Because it is made by hand, because every building is different, because every building is a specific different project, which is entirely executed by artisans. It is, a primitive, backward technology. If we could make houses in a factory in the same way as we make automobiles, we could mass produce standard houses, and we could make them for way cheaper because we could achieve economies of scale. So just like Henry Ford standardized the automobile, Le Corbusier thought, Le Corbusier, at that point he had already changed his name, I want to standardize housing. I want to make factories. I want to make houses in a factory, standard houses, the same house for all. I shall make it in a factory. I shall make it fast. I shall make it cheap. everyone will have it, and I'm an architect, Le Corbusier, I will make it beautiful because that's my job. That was his plan. And the first car, not the first car, but the first house he designed was, you see it here, serial house Citroën, spelled in two different ways. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of automobiles, and I do not know if Citroën cars were ever exported to China, but Citroën was at the time the second best, so to speak, or the second biggest French car manufacturer. It still exists, by the way, but now it's no longer an independent car maker, and it is owned by a big, anonymous global. But the brand still exists, even if it's, meaning when I was a child, a long time ago, Citroën still had a very distinctive style. If some of you like automobiles, you probably know how important Citroën is in the history of car styling. But anyway, that was not Le Corbusier's argument in 1921. What he thought is that he knew that Citroën was the first European car maker who had adopted the Fordist moving assembly line. And so to celebrate the technology of Citroën, he wanted this house he called the Citroën house, a house which he explains should be made in a factory. Then you look at the detail and you will realize that honestly, he did not have the faintest idea of how this house, or any house for that matter, could be made in a factory, because he explains this house is made in reinforced concrete. Reinforced concrete, mind you, we are in 1921. Reinforced concrete in 1921 is a brand new technology. It had been around only for a few years. The first regulations explaining how to calculate reinforced concrete in France came out in 1911. So it was brand new, and architects had not yet figured out what to do with it. So the idea that Le Corbusier had is that this mass-produced house should be made in a factory and should be made of reinforced concrete. Then in the footnote here, he explains that in fact they could not make this house in a factory. Most of the reinforced concrete should be made on site, because prefabrication of reinforced concrete is still almost impossible today. In 1921, it was science fiction. So his idea to mass produce an industrial house in a factory, when he explains that he wants to build it in reinforced concrete, he doesn't know how to do that. And honestly, 100 years later, we can still claim that it is basically impossible to prefabricate a house in a factory if we want to have it made in reinforced concrete. Metal, different story. You make it in steel or iron, you can make it in a factory, then the assembly is made on site with nuts and bolts. But the reinforced concrete, all the pieces must be tied together. It has to be made on site. So the idea was to mass produce an industrial house, but he didn't know how to do it, because you cannot really do it if the material you choose is reinforced concrete. But that was the idea. Now, the details, he knew that the technology was not yet really available. The idea was mass produce and standardize, make a house in a factory so it will become standard and cheaper and as easily available as a washing machine or as an automobile, because that was his model. This is why he called it the Citroën house. Now, in 1922, so 1 year later, he published this famous plan of a city for 3 million inhabitants, a picture which is in all the history books. I'm certain you have already seen it. And now, when we look at this picture today, we think that we have already seen it many times, because in the 104 years which have gone since then, these ideas have been followed in many countries around the world. But the point is, when Le Corbusier made this drawing in 1922, nobody had ever seen anything like that. Now the buildings, think of it, these are ideally mass-produced standardized buildings. So these are buildings which are made, he claimed, in a factory, just like automobiles would have been made. So buildings are made like cars, but this is a city which is made for cars, because the main protagonist of the city is the automobile. And what is drawn here in the middle is a highway. Well, we know what a highway looks like. We have seen it many times. But mind the dates. In 1922, highways did not exist. They had not yet been invented. If you look at the chronology, the first highway ever was built in 1923-24, so 1 year, 2 years later, in Italy, as it happens, from Milan going to the Swiss border to Varese and to Como, about 40 miles on one side, 30 miles in the other direction. But that was the first ever highway built in the world. Principle of separation of traffics, a road which has no intersection, so there are only bridges and underpasses, which is limited to automobiles. So horses could not ride on it, but not even bicycles or motorbikes, only for automobiles. No intersections, you can speed, or the speed of an automobile of the time. And importantly, you have to pay a toll. So there is a barrier you want to take, but highway, you stop, you pay, and then you speed because there is no one else. It's just a speeding, made for speeding cars. This idea of separation of traffics, of a highway, of a road, which is limited to automobiles, where automobiles can speed without any intersection. So you can speed. This, when Le Corbusier made these drawings, did not exist. The first would be built 1 year later, as it has. So the idea was probably in the air. Footnote, some claim that in America, the first so-called Parkway, the Long Island Parkway, had already been built before World War I, but it was not exactly the same principle. You didn't pay a toll, it was not for transportation, it was landscaping, so it's a slightly different story. The first highway where you pay a toll, it's limited to automobiles, just as you see it in this picture, was built 1 year after Le Corbusier made this drawing. And in 1925, he made this famous Plan Voisin, or the Voisin plan for the restructuring of the center of Paris. If you know Paris, you can tell where we are. In the middle is the Ile de la Cité. Notre Dame, the one which burned a few years ago, is on the right margin of the picture. And what you see here is between the Louvre, you see on top left, and Le Corbusier was imagining to destroy the center of Paris and rebuild it with skyscrapers and highways. The part which is mostly demolished with a big square is where now the Centre Pompidou has been built. So he could not anticipate that. But this is the idea. A new city made for automobiles, where buildings are built with the same technology which we use to build automobiles. So the automobile, the car, is the driving inspirational technology. We build cities for automobiles, and we build houses using the same technologies we use to build automobiles. It is called the Voisin plan, the Plan Voisin, spelled V-O-I-S-I-N. It's, again, if you go on Wikipedia or on any history of architecture, you will find a long chapter on Le Corbusier Plan Voisin, 1925. But mind the name, who is Voisin? Why is this called the Voisin plan? Well, Voisin was, guess what? Guess what? A car factory. There was a company called Voisin that made automobiles and also airplanes. When Le Corbusier wanted to build this maquette and to publish it, he looked for money because he didn't have any. He was just a young guy and was the beginning of his career, was not yet famous. So he went to see all the car manufacturers of the day in Paris asking for funding. He went to see, first choice, Citroën. He went to Citroën. The owner of Citroën was André Citroën, an engineer, great technologist, great car designer. And Le Corbusier managed to see him, and he said, I'm going to design a new city made for the automobile. And so you make automobile, why don't you give me some money so I can put your name on my plan and we shall both become famous, etc., etc. We don't know what André Citroën told him, but he kicked him out and he didn't give him a penny. So that failed. Second choice, went to see Renault, still a car factory today, still make automobiles. Spelling, you probably know them, but it must be everywhere. We don't know who he met at Renault, but one thing for certain, they also didn't buy it. They didn't give him a penny. So third choice, he went to see the Voisin company, and they gave him a big check. So with the money, he built this maquette, built a pavilion at the Art Decorative exhibition of 1925, and he published a small book, and he gave the name Voisin to his plan to celebrate the donor who had given him money to build it. Now, as it happens, Citroën is still around, Renault is still around, Voisin is not. And we now know the name of Voisin only because it is tied to this, project by Le Corbusier, because the company Voisin failed a few months later. So they gave money to Le Corbusier and then they ran out of money. The company folded and disappeared. So that was the last money probably spent by the Voisin company. It was to finance this Le Corbusier project. But then a few years later, Le Corbusier started to have the occasion to build something. And this is one of his first buildings as it stands today. It's in Paris, actually, as it stood a few years ago, because this picture is 20 years old, so I presume it still looks that way. This is the Swiss pavilion at the Cité Universitaire in Paris, the university city in Paris. Many nations have a residence for their own students. So, I don't know, Brazil has a building for Brazilian students. I don't know if China probably has a building for Chinese students. There must be. But in 2930, Switzerland paid for the building of a pavilion in the university city in Paris for Swiss students at the University of Paris. The building still exists, still works that way. If you are a Swiss student and you are enrolled at the University of Paris, you can apply to have a room in a Le Corbusier building. I don't need to tell you, but the waiting list is long, because you have to apply 10 years in advance to get a room in this building, because everyone wants to be there. So this is what Le Corbusier built, as it still stands. And this is how he built it in 1929. We are evidently in 1929, because look at the car here. Can I enlarge it? So you see, we are evidently in 1929 because this is a 1929 car. And you see the solution he found to the predicament in which he had found himself when he thought he wanted to mass produce and prefabricate and also use reinforced concrete, which is not good for prefabricating. He found a smart compromise, which is the following. The structure of this building, you see, it is in reinforced concrete. It is not prefabricated at all. It is all cast on site in formworks. It is artisanal, traditional, so to speak, reinforced concrete. So the reinforced concrete structure is made on site, no prefabrication, no industrialization, no standardization, pure artisanship, because each form of a cast into which you pour the concrete is made by hand, is made in timber by artisans. So this is pure craft for pouring reinforced concrete into handmade forms, molding or molds. But then look at the facade. This is what we call a curtain wall, spelling C-U-R-T-A-I-N, curtain wall. A curtain is a curtain. And the idea is the structure is built in reinforced concrete. It's made on site. It's artisanal. It's artisanal making, even if reinforced concrete is a new technology. But there is one thing which we can make in a factory, the facade, because the facade is made of steel and glass. And steel and glass is what, in 1929, they could already make in a factory. Why? Because factories made automobiles. And so metal and glass if a factory can make this, you see this, the car? If the factory can make the car, then they can make the facade of the building because it is made of the same material, steel and glass. So the idea is the structure in the reinforced concrete is made on site, but the facade is made in a factory made, mass produced, standardized. And then on site, just the assembly. A lorry comes, a truck comes, all the pieces are there. You just put them up, nuts and bolts, you assemble, and that's it. That's the idea. What we can prefabricate is the facade because it is steel and glass. And the idea is if we prefabricate the facade, this is the way it would look because all the pieces are the same. This is the way, you know, prefabrication, industrial standardization should look like. Now, as it happens, in 1929, no factory in Paris could mass produce a facade which had only, how many? Probably 50 windows. So my guess is that this was still made by hand. But the idea is today, the technology is not yet there. We make it by hand. But one day, when we have factories which can mass produce 1 million identical windows, facades per day, they will look this way. So the idea is we anticipate what the technology will look like when it can scale up, when all the parts can really be mass-produced, standardized, and prefabricated in a factory. At the same time, actually 1 year later, Le Corbusier built this other building in Geneva, not far from where he was born, in Switzerland, still standing. It is called a Maison Clarté. And here there is more steel and less reinforced concrete. Part of the structure is also on steel, but that was an accident, a coincidence, because the developer happened to own a steel mill. And so he wanted to use the steel he was making, otherwise nobody would have. But forget what the structure would look like, meaning if you go inside the building, you see, but most of the structure is actually in steel, so it is prefabricated. But have a look at what the facade, the curtain wall. This is the way an industrial facade would look like. Mass-produced, made in a factory using steel and glass, because factories in 1930 could work that way. They made automobiles, metal and glass. They could make the facade of a house in the same way. Mass production, economy of scale, standardization. Every window look the same because it is made in a moving assembly line, just the way an automobile is made. Now, when Le Corbusier in 1930-31 thought that soon every house would be built this way, he was slightly optimistic. It took longer, and that due to, you know, external incidents which Le Corbusier could not anticipate. Mind the timeline. 1929, October 1929 is the famous, notorious Wall Street crash. You know, the crack of Wall Street of 1929, when the stock exchange of the United States lost, I don't know, 80% of its value in a single day. That was the beginning of the Great Depression, which lasted throughout the 30s. Started in America, and then it hit Europe and the rest of the world. Unemployment surged, poverty, destitution. In America, there were food lines. And so the 20s was a period of great technological optimism, evidently, given the ideas we have just seen. It was also a period of great prosperity. People were getting richer, there was money for experimentation, optimism, technological optimism, economic prosperity. The 30s was a period of poverty because all the major world economies fell apart into a tailspin. And so there was no money left, many buildings stopped, and many public programs of infrastructural building were started in America, famously the New Deal, which were a way not so much to build stuff which was needed, but it was a way to give work to people who were unemployed. And so the idea of saving time and money with mass production, it was not what was needed anymore. They just needed to employ people who had lost. So they were, building dams, canals, railways, etc., etc. So in that context, experimentation with new technology, new material, forward-looking, it all stopped because the technology was probably still there, but the money to make experimentation was not. So in the 30s, all these ideas were put in the back burner because the economy was in crisis and because the consensus, the optimism concerning these new technologies had simply stopped to be. Then came the war, starting in 1939 till 1945, and during the war, not much building was going on. The ideas that Le Corbusier had been elaborating in the 20s, and he started to experiment with at the end of the 20s, in the early 30s, came to fruition. They exploded, in a sense. They became a reality in the 50s, but not in Europe, in America. Think of this building. You certainly know it. It's one of the most iconic buildings in the history of architecture, the Seagram building, built by Mies van den Rohe in Manhattan between 1954 and 1958. We are on Park Avenue, and at the, you don't see it in this picture, but at the end of this stretch of Park Avenue, there is Grand Central Station. Today you cannot see it because the Pan Am building has been built on top of it. This, as you certainly know, is Mies van den Rohe. This is the man who built it. And this is the building where the European ideas of the 20s met the American technology of the 50s. So Le Corbusier's ideas of mass producing and standardizing the facade, which he did at a very small scale here. This is a small building. This is the, the experiment. How many windows there are here? 3, 6, 9, 12, 60 windows, 30 on one side, 30 on the other. Well, a few years later, after the war, how many windows there are in the Seagram building? I don't know. I never counted them, probably 1,000. And believe me, they are all the same. They are factory made. They are mass-produced and standardized because this is what American industry in the 50s could do. And this is where the European ideas of the 20s met the American technology of the 50s. As Rem Koolhaas said a few years ago, the Seagram building is that building that no European could have built, because in Europe there was not the technology, but no Americans could have invented, because the Americans had never imagined a building like this. So you need this merger of the revolutionary ideas which came to light in Europe in the 20s when they met the technology which America had in the 50s, and they could bring these ideas to fruition at this, well, gigantic scale. And the person who made this happen was him, Ludwig Mies van den Rohe. You see him here when he was a famous man. He was almost exactly the same age of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was born in 1887, and Mies van den Rohe was built in 1886. So he was 1 year older. He lived a bit longer because Corbusier died in 65, and I think Mies died in 69. So a few years. So this picture was probably taken in the 60s. You see, he was in one of his typical expression, smoking a big cigar, sitting on one of his own chairs. That's a Mies van den Rohe chair. By the way, this is Mies van den Rohe as an old man, and this is the same person who was a young man, and he was not famous at all. Strange to think, but this one, they are the same person. This is Mies van den Rohe at the beginning of his career, when his name wasn't even Mies van den Rohe, because just like Corbusier changed his name, so did Mies van den Rohe. They also became famous with a fake name, a name they made up. When this picture was taken, it was Ludwig Mies van den Rohe. When this picture was taken, it was simply Ludwig Mies. The van den Rohe didn't exist. He wanted to look, more posh. And so at some point, he wanted to add a fake aristocratic name and decided to call himself von der Rohe, but he couldn't do that because in Germany at the time, you couldn't make up an aristocratic name unless you really came from an aristocratic family. So he made up a fake Dutch aristocratic name, Van Lies van den Rohe, but still, it's a fake name, a name which he made up to pretend he was rich and famous when he was. I mean, he was the son of a bricklayer, and he got the basic technical training. He never went to a high school, which is why when this is him when they were designing the Seagram building, and you see the team which built the Seagram building, Mies van der Rohe is in the middle. The person here on the right is Phyllis Lambert, who is still alive. She was the daughter of the owner of the building. And she's, to some extent, if you know the story, she's the person who persuaded her father to hire Mies van der Rohe to build the building. She was 22 or 23 years old when she did that. She was not even an architect. Eventually, she became an architect. Eventually, she collaborated with Mies van der Rohe. She studied architecture. She became an architect. Then, if you know the story, being a very wealthy woman, she founded the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal, which still exists. And she still lives there, aged, I think, 98 at this point. She's still there. Whereas Ludwig Mies van der Rohe is dead. And the person on the left is Philip Johnson, the famous New York architect, the MoMA director for many years. And if you look at the official documentation, the Seagram building was signed by Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson together. And you know why? Because when Ludwig Mies van der Rohe emigrated from Nazi Germany to America in 1938, starting a new career there in Chicago, he became a registered architect in the state of Illinois, where Chicago is based, but he had never built in New York. When they built the Seagram building, which is in New York, they found out that he could not be a registered architect in New York because in Germany, he never finished school. So he didn't have a school leaving certificate. So he could be an architect in Chicago, but not in New York. So in New York, he could not build. He could not be an architect. And so he had to partner with Philip Johnson, who was an architect. And so the architect of record is Philip Johnson, even though Mies van der Rohe was the architect, but he could not be an architect in the state of New York in 1954, because in Germany in the 20s, when he went to school before World War I, he didn't go to a high school, didn't have an official high school certificate. Have a look at a detail of the facade of the Seagram building. You will see that all the windows are exactly identical. Yeah, that's the spirit, that's the logic. There are probably 6,000 windows. They are made in the factory, they are made in like a Ford Model T, they're all the same, glass and metal. We know why, that's the spirit. You will also notice that the windows, each window, there is a curtain inside each window. It's a Venetian blind, because mind the dates, we are in the 50s. Glass reflecting mirror did not exist yet. So the mirror was entirely transparent. You could see through, because the mirror glass, which is often used in skyscraper today, did not yet exist. So you see through. So you see in each window a blind, a Venetian blind, which is either entirely pulled or entirely open. And some of them, look at row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they are all open halfway. And you may notice that when the Venetian blind is pulled halfway through, they are all aligned. So the height where the Venetian blind on the interior of each window stops is the same in every window. You see, it is the same in every window all over the building. Every window where the Venetian blind is pulled halfway stops at exactly one position. And you may think that's a coincidence. No, it isn't. That's design. That was Mies van den Rohe's idea, because he knew that since the glass was transparent, what you see, particularly at night, when all the lights are on and all the glass is see-through, will be determined by the position of the blinds inside each window. And he didn't want that to look disorderly. He wanted each window to look the same because they are the same. He wanted this idea of identical repetition to be visually evident. And so how do you do that if in every window, every user can pull the blinds in a different way? Well, he designed a mechanism, which was designed by the office of Mies van den Rohe, whereby if you are in one of those offices to this day, and you pull the blind down, because you want to close the window, so you pull it down, you will find that there is only one level where the mechanism clicks and stops. If you pull it lower, it goes all the way to the bottom. If you pull it higher, it goes back all the way to the top. It only clicks at one height, the height which you see in this picture, which was precisely calculated by Mies van den Rohe based on proportional criteria. He wanted to stop right there, and he wanted it to stop right there in every window all over the building, on all the four sides of the building, because he wanted identical replication to be visually evident. Now, much irony has been made of this mechanism, which is still there, and they cannot remove it because now the building is a historical monument and you cannot change it because it is protected by, it's a listed monument of state of New York or something, so they cannot change it. But think, meaning when, who wrote From Our House to Bauhaus, meaning many postmodernists made fun in recent times of this apparent perversion of the idea that if you work inside of one of these offices for many years, and you always pull the blind, and it always only stop at a certain height, at some point you will get, you know, your body will get used to that motion because it only clicks at a certain height, and it will, you know, affect your body, your movement, etc., etc. Think of a standardization of a gesture. This is like being in a moving assembly line. If you are a worker in a moving assembly line, you have to repeat the same motion all day long. And if you pull the blinds in this building, you have to pull the blind at a certain height, which is always the same light, and it has been the same height since 1958, when the building was inaugurated. This blind only stopped at one height, which was calculated by Mies van den Rohe himself. And you cannot have it in any other position. This is the technical logic of mechanical machine making. This is the aesthetic which is based on that logic. Mind you, mass production and standardization have one reason: to achieve economies of scale, to make things cheaper. Now, the Seagram building is not a cheap building. It's one of the most expensive buildings ever built, because it is not made of, you know, steel or aluminum. It is made of a very expensive alloy of bronze. So it's almost as expensive as gold. And all the technical solutions were new, and so it was an extraordinarily expensive building. So this idea of standardization, which you see on the facade, is not meant to save money, is meant to represent, symbolize, monumentalize the idea of standardization. This is a celebration of a technical logic. This is the representation of a spirit, of the spirit of a technology. This is what the machine-made environment should look like. This is a monument to the modern industrial age. This is the style of industrial modernity converted into a monument. And if I tell you this story, it is because the digital doesn't work that way. It's all the opposite. Let me have a look at the time. What I suggest now is that perhaps I make a 5-minute break not only to drink a cup of coffee, but also to move my computer to another room, because here there is a lot of noise from a building site and is getting a bit a problem for me because it's too loud. So can we have a 5 minutes break? So
Yes.
I have a cup of coffee and I restart from another room, which is dark and without windows. And so I will be protected by the noise of these workers that are making a huge mess just outside of my windows. 5 minutes break, then we restart, okay? I will be with
Okay.
you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we are back.
Good. Because where I was, I could only hear the noise of the jackhammers in the building site just in front of my windows.
Okay.
So part two, let's restart from where I stopped. So the last picture I had before the intermission was here. This is the world of yesterday. And this is the world of today. And as already mentioned, the technical logic of digital mass customization is the opposite of the technical logic of industrial mass production and standardization. Not only it is the opposite of that technical logic, not surprisingly, it looks different because it works differently. What you see on the screen is a CNC milling machine, which was the iconic technology of the digital revolution in the 90s. There was a time in the late 90s when many of you were probably not born. I mean, the students, when every school of architecture in Europe and in America wanted to have a CNC milling machine because that was the best benchmark for experimentation of the new technology. The one you see on the screen is not just any milling machine. It was the CNC milling machine in the office of Greg Lynn, was one of the protagonists, of the inventor, of the theoreticians, who created the digital turn in the 90s. That was his own milling machine, which he had in his office in Venice, California, and it was filmed in a TED talk, which he did in 2005. And for those of you who remember, that was the time when Greg Lynn was one of the most influential architectural thinkers around the world. He was, on CNN and on the general press, because he was among the first to come up with a way to explain what the digital was doing and to interpret as an architect what the digital could do. And so I remember when we first saw the demonstration, which he did with this very machine, the one we see on the screen now, which I saw a few years earlier. It was in 2000 or 2001 when I lived and worked in Los Angeles briefly, and I was at the Getty Institute, and at the day, Greg Lynn was, a celebrity. So, well, he still is, but at the time it was even more. And so we organized a small guided tour for the art historians in residence at the Getty Research Institute. It was a museum. I was the only architect in the team, so I was the one who organized the visit, and we went to see Greg in his office, and he made this demonstration to a group of art historians who were not designers, so they were not particularly familiar with the technology, which at the time was brand new. And he made this memorable demonstration, which I still remember, and I'm certain all that were there on that day will remember as well. In his office, there was, all the screens, the computer, the monitors, etc., etc. Then there was a separation, a glass wall, and on the opposite side there was this machine. And the demonstration he made was that we sat with one of these associates in the office, and we could see how the panel was drawn on the screen, so modulation and ondulation, etc., etc. And the designer tries several different configuration of the surface of the panel with all the kind of hills and valleys and ridges, which milled panels at the time typically did. And that was the idea. When the image on the screen was good, when there was the notion that that was the one we wanted, he pressed print. And the panel was printed, but not 3D printed, it was milled. So next door, where the milling machine was, the mill started to run horizontal lines over a panel of timber, which was plywood or something cheap. And so, the principle, each pixel was milled at a different height because each pixel was represented by an X, Y, Z coordinate, which was a location in space, and it was milled. And so it took some time, and line after line, the entire surface of the panel was, manipulated and was carved. But this was the thing. If it took 10 minutes to mill the surface, and if the panel cost, let's say, $100, and the cost of the operation was the same, let's say that that panel was made, took 10 minutes to make it, cost $100, then if you wanted another panel, if you wanted a copy, an identical copy of the same panel, it would take the same time to make, and it would cost the same time, the same price at the end, because it would take the same time. If you wanted a different panel, assuming that you had the time to change the design on the screen, evidently, that was not taken into account, but the fabrication took the same time, cost the same money. So the idea is, if you want to make 100 identical panels, it's not that they will become cheaper if you make more. They will always cost the same. And if you want to make them all different, it's not that they will cost more if they are different. Each panel will always take 10 minutes to make. It will always cost $100. If you make 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion, all the same, they will always cost the same. That is what we call a flat marginal cost. The cost of the next copy you make will be the same as the cost of every copy you made. Every copy is, in a sense, a new original. This is, as already mentioned, exactly the opposite of the technical logic you see here. Here, they are all the same because they represent and they symbolize the technical logic of a way of making where if you make more, they will cost less. Assuming that this facade is made using digital technologies, each window could be different at the same cost per window. Standardization no longer represent an economy of scale. Variations no longer represent an additional cost. If you make each window this way, using digital technologies, we could make them all different at the same unit cost. This idea is gone, is obsolete. If you use mechanical technologies, this makes sense. If you use digital technologies, this doesn't make any sense. Of course, we lived in a world where we have been accustomed for the last 200 years to think that standardization saves money. Standardization saves money only if we use mechanical technologies. If you use digital technologies, standardization is irrelevant. It doesn't cost less, and variation do not cost more. This is a complete change of the way we look at the world, in a sense. This doesn't mean that everything should be different, because things sometimes need to be different, sometimes they don't. It simply means that the principle according to which standardization represents a way of making which is pursuing economies of scale does not apply anymore, insofar as we are adopting today's digital technologies. Now, this is Greg Lynn himself in a picture of a few years ago. That's the, you may have seen him, meaning it's still around. This is exactly at the same time, year 2000, where this demonstration with the milling machine was made. This is a piece of post-industrial design, so to speak, which was at the time very famous, and it still is because it is now a collector item, which is in many museums around the world. What you see is the prototype of Greg Lynn's Alessi teapot series. You can Google it, you will find 100 websites that tell the story. I've told the story myself in books I wrote. These, strangely enough, these are teapots or tea and coffee table set made for the Italian tableware company Alessi, which is also famous. They gave this commission to Greg. Now, if you look at them, it looks as if each one of these pieces had been milled in a milling machine or 3D printed. it is not so, because each one of these pieces contains, contains some liquid, so it has two surfaces which are convoluted, and it is in fact the fabrication process for what is known was extremely complicated, because each one of these leaves, it looks like a leaf of a tree, but each one of these leaves is made of several layers of metal which had to be welded. So there is a lot of craft, but we don't know about that. We're supposed not to know it. If we look at it, it looks as if each piece had been, 3D printed as a single block, a monolith. And then the logic of 3D printing applies. You can make them all different at the same unit cost. And in fact, that was Greg Lean's idea. This is a textbook demonstration of the technical logic of mass customization, digital mass customization, because it was a series of teapot where each one was different. So, oh, someone is knocking at the door. Never mind. Hold on, because I'm in a closet and stay there. Okay, sorry. This happens when you are speaking from a closet because you have to protect myself from the noise. So never mind. So this is a series, an industrial series, where each item is different. Now think of it. If you think of a teapot or a coffee machine made in a factory, you think that they're all the same. These are the Greg Lean LSC teapots, a series where each one is different but similar to all the other ones. So teapot number 1 is similar to but different from teapot number 2, etc., etc. By the way, he only made 99. This is not an open-ended series, but this is arbitrary. He could have made, 1 million, 1,000, or 500. He made 99. That was a marketing choice. But the point is, of the 99 he made, each one is different, but they all look similar. So if you see them, you see this is a Greg Lean LSC teapot. But the number 22 is slightly different from the number 24. This is the idea of similarity and variations. But this is the thing. Assuming, think of the technology where these things were made. If this is a single block, say a monolith, a single block which has been 3D printed, as if it had been milled in a milling machine, these technologies have a limitation in the size of the stuff they can print. That's self-evident. If it is 3D printed, it must be smaller than the 3D printer into which it is printed. If it is milled at a milling machine, the panel must be smaller than the milling machine which is milling it, which means that this technology is very good if you want to make a teapot, small, or a panel, which was in that case 1 meter over 2 meters. But to 3D print a house, you would need a 3D printer, which is bigger than the house you print, which is not very practical. So these technologies, which were, the beginning of a digital turn and experimentation in the 90s, at the time, we already knew that scaling up, not in numbers, but in size, would be a major issue. How do you scale up? How do you make these things bigger if the size of what you make is determined by the size of the machine which we use to make it? Now, one solution which was found, which is still occasionally, mentioned, is called contour crafting, and you're certainly familiar with it. And the idea is indeed that you build a machine which is bigger than the pieces you're making. So if you want to print a teapot, a 3D printer this size is good enough. If you want to print a house, you must build a huge machine, a crane, as in this case, which is bigger than the house you're printing. And these technologies have been around and people have been talking about them for at least 25 years. And the principle is that you extrude concrete as if from a toothpaste tube, and then you spray it, and the machine is bigger because it goes around, etc., etc. And experiments are still being made, and you're certainly familiar with them because they have been often published and they are in the press. There is an entire village of 3D printed concrete house which has recently been inaugurated somewhere in Texas, etc., etc. This technology, contour crafting, has been lavishly financed by American institutions because they assume it will be useful not so much to build housing for us on Earth, but for space exploration, because we think that's the technology we need when you need to build something on the moon, which of course is not our immediate concern because we need houses here, not necessarily on the moon. So this is one way. Have a technology where the printer is bigger than what you print. So if you want to print a skyscraper, you must have a printer which is bigger than the skyscraper. That is never going to happen. That's a dead end, which is why starting from around that time, we are in 2000, 2001, 2002, another idea came up, the idea of assembly, using digital technologies to put together pieces which are smaller. And Greg Lynn is again related to this story because around 2000, 2001, 2002, he was for a while a professor at the Polytechnical School in Zurich. That's before he went to Vienna, where he's still teaching to this day. And I mean, his last class is probably next week, and then he will retire as of the end of June. And when he was in Zurich, among his students, there were two young Swiss students, Fabio Gramazio and Matthias Kohler. They learned from him the idea, they developed from him the idea of using robotic arm for bricklaying. And this is to this day what has made Gramazio and Kohler famous. Now they are both professors at the Polytechnical School in Zurich. This is an experiment they did 20 years ago. And this is the way to adapt industrial robotics to the manipulation of standardized construction parts, the brick. Now, the robotic arm, the one you see on the screen, is evidently not a new technology. It has been around for quite a long time. The industrial robot, which you see in this picture, this is a Unimate robotic arm from the 70s, but the technology, the patent, is from the early 60s. This is industrial robotic automation. And these robotic arms, they were also known as playback robots because they were supposed to be used in a moving assembly line that is a car factory, evidently, replacing human workers because they were cheaper, but they were following the same technical logic. Remember, in the moving assembly line, the worker repeats the same motion all day long. Not many motion, but just one like this, tack, 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 sometimes slightly more complicated, but always the same operation. Put a wheel here, and so always the same wheel all day. When humans were replaced by a robotic arm, these robots were doing the same job. So they were programmed to repeat the same motion from sunrise to sunset, always the same motion. They were very stupid robots because they were replacing very, elementary operations. Now, this robotic arm, this is already a slightly different logic because think of it. The bricks are standard, right? They're all the same. So we could assume that the operation of bricklaying is also standardized. You take the brick from the conveyor belt, brings the brick to the same location, you take it and you put it on the wall. Tack, 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 like in a moving assembly line in a car factory. But is it the same motion? Think of it. If you are building an automobile, it is the same motion because you take a wheel from here, you put it there, and then the conveyor belt moves the car forward and another brings in a new wheel. So you repeat the same operation, you take a new wheel and you put it into a new car which moves forward. The motion of the robot is the same. If you're building a wall, it doesn't work that way because even assuming that the brick is always the same and you always take it from the same slot, the place where it's going, the destination, cannot be all the same, because once brick number 1 is put into place, brick number 2 cannot be going to the same place because that place is already taken. So you must put it next to the brick number 1 or on top of it, on the right, or etc. So motion number 2 must be different from motion number 1 and motion number 3. So every motion must be different based on where the new brick is going. So you have to program each motion in a sequence, which you can do because you know the size of each brick and you know precisely where every brick must go. But yet, these are completely different logic, because think of it, comparing. These are standard parts, and the robots is carrying out standard motions. All the parts are the same, all the motions are the same. Here, all the parts are the same, but every motion is different because the brick has to go to a different place. Next stop or next step, with more intelligent robots which soon or already are being driven by artificial intelligence. They have computer vision, they have adaptivity, they can adapt the motion they're doing to what is happening. Now, when the robot becomes more intelligent, we don't need all pieces to be the same. So we could imagine this operation made not with standard bricks, which are all the same, but with non-standard bricks, which is, if I understand correctly, what Philip and his teams have been doing, using recycled bricks, which may not all be the same. But go one step even further. Imagine that you're working with not bricks, which are, after all, factory made, so in principle, they're all the same, but you're working with stones as found, boulders, pieces of rubble which you find in a field, made by nature or made by recycling, stuff we find, they could be all different. Now, if the robot is intelligent, it can pick and choose, and then it can choose where each piece should go based on a calculation of how you optimize the location and the geometry of each different piece. So we could go to a next step where all the parts are non-standard because they're made different, because you find them and they are different. And all the motions are non-standard. So there are 3 steps of robotic. The old industrial robotic, standard parts, standard motion. Then the post-industrial robotic of Gramazzi and Kohler, standard parts, non-standard motion. The next step, which is robots driven by artificial intelligence, random parts and intelligent motion, or non-standard and non-standard. Now, some of our friends like Gilles, whom you know from our, have already been interpreting this with the idea of a distributed robotic microfactory, where, as in experiments that I understand Philip is also doing, the robots can be taken to different places in a container, and it can do the assembly where needed as needed. So in this case, the factory doesn't exist anymore. The distributed robotic microfactory, which we are conceiving, is an automated artisan shop. Now, to conclude, think of the irony of how our view of technology has changed in the space of 1 century. When Le Corbusier was dreaming of his own technology of the future, the idea is, or was, that the building site should be industrialized. The building site, which was artisanal and backward and retrograde, should become a modern factory. We should convert the building site, traditional and retrograde, into a modern industrial factory. So we should make buildings as we make automobiles. That was the dream of 100 years ago. Today, what is happening is exactly the opposite. The factory does not exist anymore. It's not that the building site should imitate the factory. To some extent, the factory is being dissolved, distributed, broken apart. The factory is being dissolved into a constellation of local new digital artisan shop. So the old dream was the building site becomes a factory. Today's perspective is that the factory becomes a building site because it doesn't exist anymore. So we are doing the opposite of what Le Corbusier dreamed 100 years ago. That doesn't mean that Le Corbusier was wrong. Le Corbusier was absolutely right in interpreting the technology of his time. But just as he interpreted the technology, which needed the technical logic of the factory to take over, now we must interpret today digital technologies, which indicate that the technical logic of the factory is over. It's obsolete. We should reinvent a way of making where the factory doesn't count anymore, where digital craft replaces the factory, including in the way we build houses. And this is where perhaps I should stop for today because the next topic, probably better I keep it for next week. And so today we have some time for question and answers. What do you think? Philip, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Good. So you manage the discussion.
Okay, great. I think it's a mind-blowing lecture, actually, especially from the technology perspective, to have a review on the history of the last century. I think it's a very interesting perspective. So the highlight, including Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, all the way to Greg Lin. I think some iconic figure in the history.
Do you know Greg in person? Do you know him?
No, I never met him before. But actually, my generation influenced a lot by his books. You know, his theory, his practice, and his suspicion. I think he is a very good academia educationer. I think actually his theory and thinking influenced a lot to my teaching and my practice, actually. Yes. Last time when Peter Hasselman visited my office, the first question
Peter came.
Yeah, Peter put forward. Do you know Greg Lin? Same question. Have he came to visit your office? So it's interesting. Actually, we are my generation. Actually, he is like 10 years younger, older than me. I think, but when he was young, I'm actually during my PhD study or graduate study. So his theory, his theory and his books influence a lot my generation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. And especially you put forward some keywords. I think based on that, we can make further discussion, which is about standardization. Actually, is all the way we can check him back from Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe from the modernism time. And we can all the way go into some robotic fabrication. It's also, we try to challenge what is standardization and customization. I think there's a different definition of the process in architecture construction, but it's totally the difference between modernism and contemporary design, actually, which influence a lot. We can make some discussion on these two keywords. And secondly, you also mentioned a lot about the flat margin cost. I think that is very interesting. In Mies van der Rohe's Sigram skyscraper, I heard it's extremely expensive. I remember we have a DigiFuture PhD courses teaching by MIT professor. I cannot remember. Maybe Chao, you can remember the name. But I think he also mentioned it's extremely expensive. The Sigram high-rise facade system, because it's kind of alloy crown material. I think it's very special, and also all the way go to some details. I think although at that time its industrialization is beginning, but still a lot of like human labor quality you can see from such kind of details, and that is totally different to the classical handmade details, which because this kind of steel and some metal material actually should base on machine and human collaboration. Otherwise, you cannot custom them to special standard components, right? So that is very interesting. The flat margin cost in the modernism, actually, the standardization, which actually go to the same component and same cost, right? When we go into some customization, maybe the flat margin cost is the same time, same machine, but actually all the component could be different. It's belong to a family, but could be slightly different. Yeah, so that is very interesting perspective to make difference from the modernism to the contemporary design. And thirdly, I think also you mentioned the keywords assembly. I think that's the skill matters. I think it's interesting to mention the contour line printing in the States or maybe in Europe because all the houses maybe 2 or 3 floors high. But in China, we are encountering different situation, a lot of high-rise buildings. We cannot make a machine big enough to print the whole building in one machine. So that is probably the challenge. Also, we have a lot of critical points or perspective or comments. They don't think the 3D printing could be the future because you cannot print the building once in one construction site. So from this perspective, I think it's important to talk about assembly, the assembly futures, and also the scale of the components or the prototype matters to integrate the technology with the construction technology. I think I can find very interesting points from your lecture today, and which is especially interesting because that is totally different to the other historical causes. Is quite interesting from the technology perspective, and this technology is more on the construction technology. I think the machine and the tools actually influence a lot to the history evolution, and also some car industry like the car industry also could be like learning from the car industry. I think our minister in construction in China, he actually make a special speech last year, and he highlight the future of China construction industry also should learn from the car industry, because the electric car is so popular right now in China. When maybe when you visit Shanghai, I will show you 50%, almost 50%. The vans and cars on the street right now in China becomes the electric car. So our minister in construction mentioned we should learning from the electric car to install future houses that could be electrified or some autonomous agent-based intelligent housing project. That is something he mentioned we should learning. I think it's very interesting. Again, goes back to the history about Le Corbusier. I think although it's around 100 years ago, we are counting the similar question. So the electric car and the vote and the citizen, as you mentioned, are quite different. So that's a lot of different. And also, secondly, he mentioned when we're constructing the future house, we should also learn from car industry. I think, and as all the way goes to maybe from Le Corbusier, he tests to failure actually, I think, in France. But his theory totally influenced the housing industry in China. Over the past 40 years, actually, the pattern or the business model of the real estate actually all Le Corbusier's theory influence. You can see in China, all the buildings and also the gated community is with a very big piece of green land in the middle, and the park in the middle, and also the ground floor could be like the the wind can transparently flowing through the building, and actually the lobby is extremely luxury to be some water landscape and water surrounding. So it's like the park on the ground, the people living in the sky. So that's Le Corbusier make his manifesto, I think almost 100 years ago, but actually over the past 30 years, I think China is the most follower or believer to Le Corbusier practice. Interesting.
You know,
I think-
Remco last 20 years ago became famous because he claimed that Singapore was the reincarnation of modernism, but he had not seen China. He had not seen China is the real incarnation of modernism.
Exactly. So I think I don't know if the PhD students in class, you have any question would like to put forward. I think you're welcome to go first. Chao, are you here?
I do not see anyone.
Yes, we
Yeah. Oh, I
Yeah.
see you. Now I see you.
Yeah.
I see you and myself on a big screen behind you.
On the wall screen. I think it's welcome the PhD candidates, students. If you have any questions, you're welcome to put forward firstly, based on today's lecture.
I see that there are three comments in writing. Let me see.
Okay, great.
Chatting as a guest. No, the first one is nothing. Type message. No, there are no messages. It was just the opening of the system, but nobody has typed anything. So no, there is nothing in writing. No, what you say, the two ideas, the flat marginal cost and the decreasing marginal cost, the two diagrams, the one with the curve, the law of decreasing marginal cost, which means that the next copy you make is cheaper than the last copy you made. The more you make, the less it costs. That's logic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the horizontal line, the flat logic, that is where variations don't cost more. So the two diagrams represent modernism and digital, in a sense. Decrease marginal cost, the more copies you make, the cheaper each copy will be. The horizontal, the flat marginal cost, making more will not cost less. And of course, if most things we do, the reality stands in the middle, because there is stuff which we will always need to mass produce. And there is stuff which can never be mass produced. And so it's interesting that your minister mentioned that we should take inspiration from the car industry. You should have read Le Corbusier, because that was Le Corbusier's dream 100 years ago. But the point is, when Le Corbusier was looking at the car industry in 1922 or 1925, the car industry was the pioneer of all technical innovation. So if you want to innovate as a technology, that's where you would have to look at. Today, in many cases, the car industry is not so much forward-looking, and it is not their fault. I mean, shifting to electric, of course, we have to do it. The car industry is doing it, but heating, ventilation, and air conditioning are more important for us than transportation. So if we have, a problem of carbon footprint, it is in building, it is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, climate control. This is where we should look at. And it is true they are innovative in bringing self-driving, etc., etc. Okay, but the way a car is made, once we have replaced workers with industrial robots, that, in my opinion, is, and that we did 50 years ago, that is not going to change that much, because we don't need every car to be different. Modularity for making automobiles is just fine, because if you tell me that there are 5 global models of automobile and all the rest is made by modular permutation, etc., etc., this is more or less what's already happened. meaning most American cars, they sometimes look different, but most of the components are common. The engine is common, et cetera, et cetera. So at the end of the day, we don't need to customize every car, because even if I could have my car different from that of my neighbor, why would I want that? I remember discussing this with German friends. They all like the big Mercedes, Germans have Mercedes, etc. I say, why should my Mercedes be different from that of my neighbor? We actually want my Mercedes to be identical to the Mercedes of my neighbor, because a Mercedes looks like a Mercedes. If a Mercedes looks different, it's no longer a Mercedes. So there is only a limited demand for variations in the making of an automobile, whereas there is a huge demand of variations in the making of cities and in the making of housing. So when Le Corbusier wanted to take inspiration from the standardization of making automobiles 100 years ago, he was doing the right thing. But today, I think that the automobile industry has to look to us for inspiration, not the other way around, because we have an idea of making things customized, which is more than they need. Because if you make a car, I mean, if you're Tesla have what, 3 models? Probably enough. They don't need 99 models, and certainly they don't need every Tesla to be different. Because if you buy a Tesla, you want everyone to know it is a Tesla. So it has to look like a Tesla. So the demand for variation is probably limited in the case of the standard industrial products. But in making houses, it's a different story, because it's not just, the social demand. I mean, some people want their house to be different, some people like them to be all the same, but we build in different geographies. If you build on a hill, it's different than building in the plains. If there is a river, you have to adapt to the topography. So building in different sites requires variations and adaptivity. We cannot make all the houses the same. You can make some houses the same, but at some point, if you build on the seashore, on the lakeside, or on a mountain, you have to change something. So variations is inevitably embedded in the building and construction industry. So we are those who need customization. Car makers doesn't. Tesla doesn't need to customize. For them, making every Tesla look like a Tesla is a marketing device. Otherwise, they don't sell them.
Good.
Someone asked something.
Hong Hao, if you have a question, please directly ask Professor Amaro.
I see a question here, but let's see. How do someone called Zhang?
Yes.
Zhang, do you want to read your question, or should I read your question?
Feng Hao, could you ask directly?
I can read the question. I can repeat the question.
Yes,
So I'm
yes,
just
go ahead.
sorry. I will find the. So my question is about just basis on today's lecture, and how do you think like the current technical logic of the handmaking right now, and in nowadays context, like the technology logic of the handmaking, and also between the mechanical reproductions, and also for the digital making, how can they differentiate the design process and also the fabrication process?
That is exactly where I would start my next lecture. Let me show you my next slide. If I can still share screen. Where was I? Oh, hold on. Desktop 1, share. Where did my slides go? Here. So I was here. So my next slide would have been, I've explained to you handmaking, mechanical machine making, the technical logic, the spirit. Then you think, the digital turn in architecture, how does this relate to this? Or this?
Yeah.
Or this? You know this one. Or this? Or this? Or this? How do this big, picture of the technical logic relate to the styles of digitally intelligent design for the last 25 years? This is going to be the topic of my, the next 2 years with you, or something like that. because once we know that digital mass customization is the core technical logic of digital making, and we have been aware of that since the mid-90s, thanks to Greg Lynn, Bernard Cash, the Deleuze connection, etc., etc. The way we adapt digital theory, digital design to this awareness of digital mass customization, this is the main theoretical problem, because you may want to relate to that, you may want to oppose that, you may want to exploit it, or you want to. So at the beginning, in the 90s and in the 2000s, there was this idea that digital mass customization in architecture meant digital streamlining. We called it digital streamlining, and then Patrick Schumacher started to call it parametricism, and we still call it parametricism, but I still prefer to call it digital streamlining because this is what it is. Now, how does digital mass customization relate to digital streamlining? Not very much, meaning we can make every panel different. Look at this famous, Zaha Hadid piece. This is cladding, meaning I don't know how many panels were used to make this. You could not make a building like that if you could not digitally mass produce each panel different from all other panels. If you had to make every panel by hand, that building would cost, an unimaginable amount of money. So that would not be practical. So the idea that each panel can be digitally mass customized without a supplemental cost is the technical logic which underpins this way of building. But then, why should it be digitally streamlined as if it were an airplane, the wing of an airplane, or if it were an automobile? Automobiles and airplanes are digitally streamlined because spline modeling comes from aerodynamics. It's about reducing drag, which is friction when something moves in water or in air. Streamlining, that's where it comes from. If you design a sailing boat, that's indispensable. Design an airplane, that's fundamental, because if an airplane is not streamlined, it will not fly. But that building is not meant to fly, right? Stay there, it's built there, it stays there. Why should it be aerodynamic? that's it happened. And so it's a historiographical problem. Why was the potential of digital mass customization put to task to produce for many years, mostly digitally streamlined buildings, spline modeling? Why was spline modeling so important in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and to some extent for some practices to this day? This is a problem which is not technological. It has to do with the history of architecture. This is what architects do. Sometimes they screw up. I mean, that happens. But this is forthcoming. That's forthcoming topic.
Great.
Yes,
Zhang Yulu.
thank you.
Zhang Yulu, would you like to ask a question?
Is there another question typed somewhere?
No, it's just the same question Feng Dinghao put forward.
Okay.
The same question, but I already answered.
I actually have a question because it's
Go
super
ahead.
interesting about as a pioneer in the history, actually, including Ms. Van der Rohe in his Sigaram high-rise building. You mentioned the cost of the building is actually much higher compared to the real standardization practice. So it's more like iconic or monumental
Exactly.
representation of the new history, new technology, right? I think, and all the way goes to Le Corbusier's the first building you mentioned, his real construction. We can see the facade, the window system, the metal and the glasses actually all handmade. So it looks like standardization or industrialization making elements, but actually it's handmade. So
Yes.
it's two
Because
kinds of.
couldn't do that yet. But Le Corbusier thought that at some point it would, and we now remember that his name because he was right. It did happen. He guessed it right.
So these are actually two kinds of representation or two kinds of practice in the very early experimental phases of the new technology. Actually, the first is like Zaha Hadid. When she was young, she can see the future, but actually all her building is not 3D printed or the CNC milling, but it's all the way goes to the traditional industry actually presenting her imagination of future, right? This is a kind of the more like artist,
Yes.
because artists like artistic thinking is more like they can their mindscape can predict some future. It's more like they can from their mindscape, their imagination or their consciousness, they can see something already exists, but actually that's very early phases to doing some real practice. But like Miss Van der Rohe is like the second army. Is not it's not some like the pioneer. Miss Van der Rohe, already the industry exists, but maybe at the very beginning, such kind of industry will go to extremely expensive because that's not mass production at the very beginning, because such kind of new technology can only produce very expensive industrialization process. So the big army looks like China. They practice electro-observation thinking is already 70 or 60 years later. Or in Singapore, it's same. It's already like 50, 60 years later. The Lipsis put forward his new theory. So big army is much more slow. So I think I would like to ask you how to analyze such kind of like the pioneer and the early practitioner and also the big army of the new industry. How do you think such kind of it's kind of ecosystem. Someone can see the in the history. Like to make some conclusion on the last century about such kind of different trend who play different roles actually in the history.
Yeah, you use the right word, pioneer. That was Le Corbusier was in the 20s. He was imagining the future, was anticipating. And so in the case of the Swiss Pavilion, he built by hand what he thought would give the image of what the industry would do at some point. And we still remember his name, and we still think he was a great architect because his guess was right. This is what happened. It could have been wrong, and then we would not remember his name. Not all pioneers are right, but we remember, historiographically speaking, those who had the right vision of the future. Le Corbusier, in that case, was right. He anticipated that when the industry will take over, all facades will look like this. And it did happen, because it took longer than he had anticipated. He thought it would happen right away. It happened 20 years later. But when it happened, it happened. And then Le Corbusier, after the war, could tell, well, in the 20s, I was right. I made this facade, which was basically fake, because it was imitating, using craft, what he thought at some point would become the industrial way of making, and then the industry did like that. And Le Corbusier was so much of a pioneer that after World War II, when he saw that his dream of the 20s had become a reality, he moved on. Because when industry would be building that way, he came to the conclusion that if each building is built that way, it looks a bit boring. And so in the 50s, Le Corbusier moved on and he changed his style. Le Corbusier, after World War II, when he was seeing the monster of Dr. Frankenstein, of his technological imagination of the 20s, he invented something else. He invented brutalism. He built La Tourette or Ronchamp or Les Unités d'Habitation, built in reinforced concrete sculptural shapes. It was, in a sense, and almost anticipating the digital turn with the complex geometries of what he built in the 50s and in the early 60s. So when he saw his dream become a reality, since he was always a pioneer, he was still a pioneer, he moved on and he tried to invent something else. Whereas Mies van der Rohe, when he saw that his dream of the 20s was becoming a reality, he never changed. He kept doing it all his life. That's the difference between the two. So they were both pioneers in the 20s, but in the 50s, Mies van der Rohe became the big army, as you said, and Le Corbusier was still a pioneer. He moved on. That's the difference between the two. When Le Corbusier found out that his dream of the 20s was working, he said, okay, that's over. Let someone else do it. Now let's think of something else. Whereas when Mies van der Rohe said, well, it's working, he said, well, let's do it and then we'll make a lot of money, which he did. That's the difference between the two.
Interesting. Yes. And also all the way goes to the flat margin cost. I think that's very interesting because I'm a practitioner. I think still right now the robotic fabrication, although they can make all the elements slightly different to the others, but still when we compete with the flat margin cost of the modern industry, still the modern industry make the facade, the glass system is much cheaper.
They're still cheaper than us, so they still win. Well, but that depends on the industry where we are. There are cases where mass production is not a solution, because there are cases where we need variations, and then we don't have competition because our technology is the only one. There are cases where, meaning making 1 million windows all the same is still okay, and then the factory that does it the traditional way still has a competitive edge. But for example, if you make dental implants, you cannot make them all the same because every tooth is different. So if you're a dentist, you need mass customization. You cannot mass produce dental implants because every tooth is different. So if you compete on a market where the demand for mass production still exists, as for example, the automobile, where I think most people will always want automobile to be mass produced. There is no point in trying to bring in variations. People don't want them, people don't need them, so it will always be a supplemental cost. Some people will still want their car to be different from all others, as today. If you buy a Ferrari which costs 250, $250,000, then you customize it because that's included in the price, because every Ferrari is slightly different. But for most people, that's irrelevant. However, we in the building industry, we are in between, because there are stuff where, in my opinion, it will still make sense for many years to come to mass produce identical stuff. But there are cases where the possibility of mass producing variations at an affordable price will be a remarkable asset for our creative possibility of expression. So fortunately, we still have a choice. When today, 50 years ago, we could not have chosen, because if we want variations, they cost so much that for most people, they are impossible. Today, in many cases, variations are affordable. The point is we should not waste them. For example, if you use variation to make something which looks like an airplane, but it is not meant to fly, in my opinion, that's wasteful, because that building looks like an airplane, but it's not an airplane. So why should it look like an airplane? So that's a wasteful use of the technology. But if we put the possibility, meaning it's a tool of our trade. Now we can mass produce variations. And there are cases when we want to recycle pre-existing materials, for example, when we want to use pieces which we find, when we use stone or local materials without manipulating them very much, we're dealing with variable random components is already a necessity, because it saves a lot of carbon footprint. Because if you can build with local material and you don't have to import standardized industrial materials from another continent, you save a lot of carbon footprint, and soon we'll save a lot of money. Then the problem is, how do you deal with non-standard components? 50 years ago, the only way was craft. Meaning you have an artisan, he knows how to do that because they always did it. Now artisans no longer exist, or they are too expensive. But soon robots can replace them. And then when we can do that, we win against, the big industry, because that's stuff that the big industry will never do, because they cannot do that. That's where we have, a competitive edge. If someone wants to build a skyscraper which has 1,000 identical rooms with 1,000 identical windows, they don't need us. They can do it, any construction company can do that. But my guess is that the demand for that kind of building will probably not be so important in the next, 20 years as it was for the last 20 years. because, you know, that kind of growth is probably over.
Great.
Mm.
Yeah. I think it's already very late here in Shanghai.
Yes. Also for me it's lunchtime,
Very long.
dinner time.
Very long lecture. Thank you, Mariel.
Okay,
It's
good for you. Thank you for the very good discussion and questions. And I will update you on my arrival on Friday. So we shall
Yes.
meet somewhere on Friday, and then with the classroom next Tuesday. Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're
See
looking
you
forward
soon.
next time. Yeah, to meet you on campus. Yeah, in
On
Tongji.
campus. See you
Thank
soon.
you. See you soon. Bye bye. Bye bye.